14.1, we're going to start graphing trig functions in this section. Okay, so if we were in class, I'll have you grab a calculator and graph sine of x, and this is what you would get. What you're noticing, it looks like a wave. Okay, all trigonometric functions, well, I shouldn't say all, sine and cosine will look like a wave. Now, if you notice, okay, if you look at this point here at the origin, it starts at what we're going to call the midline. If you were to cut a line right through the wave, that's the middle of it. That's called our midline. Then we're going to have a peak, top of it, and then the bottom of your wave as well. Okay, so now that we know that sine and cosine, well, here, I'll actually graph cosine for you as well. Okay, and there's one big difference when it comes to sine and cosine. Okay, so the cosine wave will be in red. Cosine does not start at the midline. It actually starts at the peak or at the bottom, actually. Okay, we will discuss when it's at the peak or at the bottom in the next section. So what we need to know for graphing trig functions is what's called amplitude. Okay, amplitude is the height of the curve from the midline, or it's cut in the middle, to the top of the curve. Okay, and the other thing is the period. Now, the length it takes for a graph to complete one cycle. Now, for one cycle, it's going to last from, if we go, well, let's do the sine wave. Okay, we're going to start at the midline. Okay, we get back to the midline here. That is not one cycle. Okay, we got to go all the way to the bottom and back to the midline. So on a sine wave, it goes, you have to go from midline to peak, midline to bottom, back to midline. That is one cycle. Okay, so from here to there is one cycle on a sine wave. Now on a cosine wave, it's a little bit easier. Okay, because you can say you start at the peak, okay, get to the midline, bottom, midpoint, and then back to peak. Okay, so it's basically from peak to a peak. That is one period for a cosine wave. All right, now the one thing we need to know is the general form, and right now we're just going to talk about sine. So f of x is equal to a times the sine of x, bx, plus k. Now a, that is what's going to tell us our amplitude. The b is what's going to tell us the number of cycles it takes, number of cycles the graph will go through in 2 pi, and then k is our vertical shift up and down. For right now, we're just going to worry about a couple of things like amplitude and that b. Now, one thing, period, okay, again, the length it takes for a graph to complete one cycle is equal to 2 pi over b. Now, if you think about it, 2 pi, if it's, the length it takes to complete one cycle, 2 pi divided by b, which is the number of cycles, we're just splitting that 2 pi, let's say it was 4. Okay, splitting 2 pi into 4 chunks. Okay, that's going to tell us how long for one cycle of our graph. Okay, so graphing the function then. Again, the a value, which is in front of the sine or cosine, that is going to be your amplitude. If it's not there, we imply that it's 1. So for this graph here, it's going to rotate between 1 and -1. And again, for sine, so we have an amplitude of 1, and then we're going to have to figure out our period as well, which again is equal to 2 pi over b, which in this case, b is always that value with x, which is 1, 2 pi over 1, which is 2 pi. Okay. So now when you're doing this, okay, this will always be 0. Okay, and then, well, before we get that, we're actually going to graph this. Sine always starts at the midline, and it goes up. Okay, the reason it goes up is because that a value is positive. Once we get to a value that's negative, that's when it will go down initially. Okay, so back to the midline, to the bottom, back to the midline. Okay, so there is our sine curve. Now, when we're doing this, all we're doing is one cycle. Okay, you gotta remember this goes on forever. You know, it goes down to the bottom, goes back to the midline. It goes on forever. Now, we just need to do one cycle. So keep in mind that that does go on, but for our sake, we're just doing the one cycle. And the reason we're doing that is to help us understand the period. Okay, it took us 2 pi to get to that. Now, we got to figure out these marks right here. So just think 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, because went from midline, peak, midline, bottom, midline. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to divide by 4. Okay, again, fractions just division. 2 pi over 4 is pi over 2. Okay, so all we're really doing is we're counting by pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, 4 pi over 2. Now, simplifying those, okay, all it really is just counting. Pi over, like if I was to keep going, 4 pi over 2, that's 2 pi. 5 pi over 2 would be the next one. 6 pi over 2 would be the next one. 7 pi over 2 would be the next one. Okay, so now keep in mind again, we need to simplify. So 2 pi over 2 simplifies to pi. You need to make those marks, okay? That is probably the hardest part when it comes to graphing these. Okay, so just remember you got 4 tick marks in there. Whatever your period is, divide that by 4. Okay, so now cosine, again, we had an amplitude of 1. You got a b value of 1, so 2 pi over 1. Again, just 2 pi. Now the difference here, again, cosine, we start at the peak if the a value is positive. Okay, later on we're going to get to negative a values. Then we would start down here, but not for now. So again, we start at the peak, go to the midline, bottom, midline, peak. There is your cosine wave. Okay, and again, our period was 2 pi. And we already divided that by 4. We got pi over 2, so counting by pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2. There's our cosine wave. All right, now let's add an amplitude and let's switch around that b value as well. So we have a little bit different period. Okay, so we got a cosine wave with an a value of 3, meaning we have an amplitude of 3. Okay, and again, we're getting that from that a value in front. Okay, period, 2 pi over b. The b value is 1, so 2 pi over 1, or just 2 pi. We just got done dealing with that. So we know this is 2 pi. We know this is 3 pi over 2 pi, and then pi over 2, and that should be 0. Now the difference here is that we have that amplitude of 3. And again, the amplitude is from the midline to the peak. Okay, so we're going all the way up to 3 and then down to negative 3. Since it is a cosine wave now, we are starting at the peak. Okay, so you go over 1 tick mark and we go from peak to midline to the bottom, back to the midline, back to the peak. Okay, so there's our curve. And there's our cosine wave for 3 cosine of x. And again, that 3 is just causing that amplitude, and we're basically giving it some type of vertical stretch. Okay. Now, next one, sine wave, meaning we're going to start at the midline. We have an amplitude of 1 because of the value in front of sine. Now, with the 1/3 x, that is what's causing the period to be a little different. We got 2 pi over b, which our b value is 1/3. So we're dividing by a fraction. Again, dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. So this is really saying 2 pi times 3, which gives us 6 pi. So in order to do one cycle, it takes 6 pi. Now, we have an amplitude of 1. And again, sine, we go up since the a value is positive. To the peak, midline, bottom, back to the midline. Now it's a matter of finding those tick marks in between. And again, we're taking the period, which was 6 pi, and we're splitting it into 4 parts. So we're going to divide by 4. 6 pi over 4 will simplify to 3 pi over 2. So that is our first one, 3 pi over 2. Now we're counting by 3 pi over 2. Okay. All it is a matter of really counting by threes. 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18. Okay, now again, they will be able to simplify like 6 pi over 2. We can simplify that to 3 pi. 9 pi over 2, nope. 6 pi. Guess what? There's that fourth tick mark. Okay, so again, after 3 pi over 2, that's going to be 3 pi. Then finally 9 pi over 2. Again, that's probably the hardest part about graphing sine and cosine waves, is figuring out your scale for the x-axis. Okay, so mixing it all together. Okay, we got an amplitude of 2. So we're going from 2 to negative 2. We'll be having a wave between those two values. It is sine, so we're going to start at the midline. A was positive, so we're going to go up to the peak first, back to the midline, down. Oh, I don't have that in the right spot. And then back to the midline. Again, that's one cycle. Oh. Let's start over on that. Okay, there's one cycle. We got our amplitude, we're good there. We just need to figure out our period. We got a b value of 2, so 2 pi over 2, or pi. So our period, the length it takes to do one cycle, is pi. And again, take that period, divide it by 4, simplify if possible. Again, right here, we're good. Okay, so pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4. Just counting by pi over 4. So 2 pi over 4. Okay, but you see 2 pi over 4, or 2/4. That's 1/2, so that's just pi over 2. And then we got 3 pi over 4. Okay. And there is our graph for 2 sine of 2x. Okay, moving on, amplitude of 1/2. Okay, period, 2 pi over b. We got a b value of 3. 2 pi over 3. Okay, so that's going to be that fourth tick mark. Now, we have a blank coordinate plane here, so as long as you can make it easy on yourself and go like this, and just make sure that it's a scale of 1/2. Okay, now here we got a cosine wave. A was positive, so we're going to start at the peak. So midline, bottom, midline, peak. There's our cosine wave. Now it's a matter of getting our scale on the x-axis. And again, to do that one cycle, it took 2 pi over 3. Okay, so then 2 pi over 3, we need to divide that by 4. Okay, 2 pi over 3 divided by 4. So again, we're dealing with fractions here, so multiply by the reciprocal. So we got 2 pi over 3 times 1/4. So then we got 2 pi over 12, just multiplying straight across, or pi over 6. So we're counting by pi over 6, so pi over 6, 2 pi over 6. And again, write it down, notice, 2 over 6 is 1/3, so we got pi over 3. 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6, which would be pi over 2. Again, if you need to write that down, go for it. Now, those need to be simplified. If you did 2 pi over 6, that's going to be docked points. Okay? And everything needs to be simplified. We're to the point where we should be able to simplify. So for this one, all it really dealt with was amplitude. So again, amplitude is the distance from the midline to the peak of your curve. Dealt with period, how long it takes to do one cycle. And to figure out that scale in between for your one cycle, take your period, divide it by 4, and then it's just a matter of counting. Again, that's typically the hard part for a lot of people. 2 pi over 3, 4 pi over 3, 6 pi over 3. All you're doing is counting by 2's in the numerator, and the denominator does not change. Other than that, if you have questions, make sure you're joining me during office hours.